Hello, I'm Chris Browder, and this is video 7.4 in my series of second language acquisition theory and research videos. In the last presentation, we learned about the role of interaction in second language acquisition. In this presentation, we will learn about the role of output, which is, speaking and writing. This presentation is generally based on Chapter 7 from Rod Ellis's text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition. I'm also drawing heavily from Chapter 5 of Seville Troik's text, Introducing Second Language Acquisition, and Chapter 2 of Lightbone and Spada's text, How Languages Are Learned. The focus on output in SLA largely comes from the work of Merrill Swain. Swain, like the other researchers we've learned about in this lesson, started off simply trying to build on Krashen's idea of input-based SLA. Krashen, as you may recall, did not think output really helped language acquisition, except that it might be self-generated input. In other words, according to Krashen, a language learner could hear himself speak, so speaking was also input, and that's, according to Krashen, how it helped. Swain suggested that output was more than just self-generated input. She pointed out that a language learner could generally understand what they heard or read using top-down strategies. And so examples of top-down strategies would be like, let's say if you're reading something, you don't know the meaning of a word, so you look at the whole thing, maybe context clues, maybe pictures or whatever, in order to get the gist of what you're hearing and maybe kind of guess what it means. You might kind of understand it vaguely, or you might be able to fake your comprehension, but you don't really understand the exact meaning of those words, and you don't really understand how those forms work, but you're getting by with reading and listening. We're often getting by without totally understanding. So for that reason, according to Swain, nothing was really ever forcing learners to process certain forms. They were maybe hearing certain forms and they were reading certain forms, but they weren't forced to really attend to those forms because those forms they could understand without attending to those forms. So an extreme example of this would be the English third person singular form, like I like, but he likes, that final S morpheme that shows that we're using the third person singular grammar. A learner does not really need to process that morpheme in order to understand the sentence. So for the learner, John like pizza and John likes pizza, there's no difference there. The meaning is the same. So the S in likes really makes no difference. So she's arguing that because it doesn't change the meaning, the learner is not forced to pay attention to it. Therefore, the learner is probably not going to learn it just by listening and reading. So Swain hypothesized that actually having to form sentences instead of just comprehend them forced the learner to process the language more deeply. A learner could fake it with input, but not with output. So Swain eventually departed from Krashen's theories in a number of ways to create what's called the output hypothesis. The output hypothesis states that production serves three important functions for language learners. The first is the noticing function, and as you can tell, she's borrowing this from Schmidt. So like Schmidt, Swain believes that learners acquire language forms when they consciously notice them and pay attention to them. According to Swain, when you have to speak or write, you often realize that you're unsure of how to use a form. So you're trying to write something and you think, is it walking or is it walked? Which one do I use, right? So being forced to speak or write forces you to think about which grammar is correct. Sometimes you realize that you don't know which one is correct, or maybe you realize that there's a word that you need to know that you don't know, or you might realize that there's a grammar form and you don't really know how to use it well. Swain referred to this as noticing, or specifically noticing the gap. So in this case, the gap refers to the gap between the interlanguage and the target language. The gap between what the learner is trying to learn and what the learner has already learned. So these situations, these noticing situations that happen with speaking and writing, cause learners to pay more attention to the input. So once they realize that they're missing something, they start paying more attention, they start looking for it. They're looking for that thing that they realize that they need. The second function of output, according to Swain, is the hypothesis testing function. Like Long, Swain believes interaction gives learners important information about the language, what is correct or what works well, and what doesn't. Swain believed that learners are always forming and revising their ideas about the target language and how it works. In other words, learners are unsure, like they're learning these rules about how to use this word or how to use this grammar form, but they're not always very certain. So they have these theories about how to use those words, and every time they speak or write, they're testing those theories about their vocabulary and grammar. So each time a learner produces output, they're testing hypotheses, and this is important, they're getting feedback. So notice here she's borrowing from Long, his whole idea of the negotiation of meaning and the negotiation of form that happens during actual communication. The learners are trying to use the language, they're speaking and writing, and they're getting feedback. Now, again, it's not that somebody's necessarily correcting them explicitly and telling them. The focus is on communication, the focus is on meaning, but it's causing them to get useful information about form. That's testing hypotheses. The third function is the reflective piece. According to Swain, learners often reflect on what they produced and how they produced it. In other words, speaking and writing causes learners to ask, did I do that right? This meta-linguistic reflection causes them to think about the language and its rules, and that causes them to learn more. Merrill Swain's work, as you can tell, is important. And so once again, we're looking at theories that began by building on Krashen's monitor model, Krashen's input-based theories of learning, and eventually departed from them, mostly departing from his idea that language learning is unconscious and gradually starting to suspect that language learning was somehow conscious, that learners were actually thinking about the language and actually paying attention to the form of the language instead of just the meaning. All right. Thank you. I hope this was helpful.